All right, to continue the pets conversation, we're happy to be joined this morning by a great friend of the show, Zaid Jilani. You guys all need to go and subscribe to Zaid's newsletter. What is it called? The American Saga? Is that the name of it?
Yeah, exactly. And I have the URL, just theamericansaga.com, so on Substack.
Amazing. Everybody should definitely check that out. So Zaid and I were able to provoke the ire of Vice Presidential candidate JD Vance. We'll get to that in a moment. But Senator Vance was on the Sunday shows making his case for sort of acknowledging that the Haitian pets lie was maybe not true, but also giving quite a noteworthy explanation for why he continues to lean into it. Let's listen to a little bit of how that went.
My constituents have brought approximately a dozen separate concerns to me. 10 of them are verifiable and confirmable, and a couple of them I talk about because my constituents are telling me firsthand that they're seeing these things. So I have two options, Dana. I could ignore them, which is what the American media has done for years to this community, or I can actually talk about what people are telling me. And of course, many of the things that the media says are completely baseless have since been confirmed. For example, I was told, Dana, that by the American media that it was baseless that migrants were capturing the geese from the local park pond and eating them. And yet there are 911 calls from well before this ever became a viral sensation of people complaining about that exact thing happening.
First of all, the Clark County Sheriff and the Ohio Department of Natural Resources reviewed 11 months of 911 calls. They only identified 2 instances of people alleging Haitians were taking geese out of parks. They found 0 evidence to substantiate those claims. But you're not just a bystander. You're the senator from Ohio. So instead of saying things that are wrong and actually causing the hospitals, the schools, the government buildings to be evacuated because of bomb threats, because of the cats and dogs thing.
But I want to start with something you said, which I think is frankly disgusting and is more appropriate for a Democratic propagandist than it is for an American journalist. There is nothing that I have said that has led to threats against these hospitals. These hospitals, the bomb threats and so forth, it's disgusting. The violence is disgusting. We condemn it. We condemn all violence.
Senator, this happened after you and President Trump were on the debate stage, said that cats and dogs were being eaten.
You asked a question, Dana, and I'm going to go ahead and answer it.
After that, they were
if I have to create stories so that the American media actually pays attention to the suffering of the American people, then that's what I'm going to do, Dana.
If I have to create stories, he says, to get people to pay attention to this, then that's what I'm going to do. It seems like a pretty extraordinary admission, Zaid.
Yeah, and I think if you watch the rest of the clip and what he's talking about, basically he substantiates that by saying that he has had constituents call in saying they've heard rumors about other people's pets, being taken, so on and so forth. So, we would use those calls to create this story to draw attention to this legitimate issue. I mean, the problem with that is, you're a U.S. senator, right? You're not someone trolling Facebook for rumors. You're not taking information that hasn't been substantiated by anyone, whether it be a reporter, whether it be police or local officials or even local NGO. You have to be responsible with how you respond to those things, right? And the reality is not one person in that town has stepped forward and said, my dog or my cat was eaten by somebody, by a Haitian person or anyone else for that matter, because then you would end up filing a police report. There would be a press story about it, and they would catch whoever was responsible. They would make an arrest, so on and so forth. The way that these urban legends spread through communities is usually that somebody says, oh, my neighbor lost their cat. It could have been a coyote, but could have also been an immigrant. And someone posted on Facebook and people say, oh, the Haitians are eating cats. I've heard that. Oh, you've heard that. We've all heard that. Over the weekend, I heard that 40 years ago in the Atlanta area where I live, when Koreans were moving in, there were rumors about cats disappearing, right? Because in Korea, dogs in the Far East is probably the only place in the world where there is some common accepted practice of eating cats and dogs, even though it's not that common among the people, and it's kind of fallen out of fashion for a lot of people. And it's actually almost impossible to find a Korean American or Chinese American who would do that here in the United States. But that's how these rumors spread and start, right? And I think, if Vance and Trump want to know how politically salient it is that they're doing this, YouGov did a poll where they found only 9% of Americans think it's definitely true, right? So for the first time, the Republicans are kind of losing an immigration debate in the past 3 years, right? So was it really the best move in the world to rely on Facebook rumors here.
Well, Zaid, you got tangled a little bit with the vice presidential candidate. B2B, please, guys. Let's put it up there on the screen. Zaid, you tweeted this. Springfield was declining for years until they saw an increase in jobs and growth driven by people moving in. That means more wealth, healthier budgets. Are there no upsides to immigration in your view? What about Usha's parents? Should they have stayed in India? JD replies to you, dude, I've always liked you, so maybe this should be a longer conversation. But come on, are there no upsides to immigration? Is a radically different question from should we drop 20,000 people from a radically different culture in a small Ohio town in a matter of years. He goes on significantly, but consider if he were here today, what would you say to him?
Well, look, I actually relate a lot to JD in some ways, right? We have a similar life story in a few different ways. I mean, for one, I think that some of what he's voicing is probably his actual view, right? I mean, they're all politicians. They're all trying to win an electoral race. But I think that his life's trajectory kind of suggests that maybe he really seems to believe what he's saying. He's someone who grew up in a town where I think his parents, and particularly his grandparents, were from a culture or subculture that he saw was dying. I think when he wrote his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, he analyzed that in sort of a personal way, right? He was kind of letting out his trauma or his childhood experiences. He kind of blamed the people around him. He blamed kind of cultural tendencies, so on and so forth. Once he got that out of his system, I think over the next few years after that, he started to look at it in a more sociological way, right? He said, well, why were these people engaged in these counterproductive, habits and cultures? Maybe, there's these larger problems with globalization, with job flight, with the easy access to drugs and counterproductive materials. And I think he started to make more of a political analysis about it, where he sees himself as representing those people. And part of what he did is, he moved back from the Bay Area. He had gone to Yale Law School, made money out on the West Coast. He moved back to Ohio, and he tried to say, I need to represent those people. I need to be a voice for them. And look, I mean, it's not that dissimilar of a story for me in many ways. I was born and raised outside of Atlanta. I went to DC for a long time. And eventually I felt the calling to come home. And so I came back here, a couple of years ago. And, a lot of people I grew up around were white folks and a little bit poorer and working class places like Mableton, where I was born. And, a lot of them flew the rebel flag, right? But also my parents were immigrants. So I knew Indians and Nigerians and Mexicans and people from all kinds of backgrounds growing up. And, you could say those are different groups of people. But there's something all of those groups share in common. And I want JD to hear this, is that people look down upon them, right? People say, they're poor, they're uneducated, they're backwards, they follow weird customs, cultures, traditions, and religions. They're always going to be in that station. But everyone I knew, from white folks flying the Confederate flag to African Americans to all these, migrants and immigrants who were coming into the area, all of them were working to try to improve themselves and better their families, right? And, I think when JD makes arguments about, housing prices or about, logistical issues, traffic, healthcare costs, so on and so forth, those are all fair things to say about the growing pains of immigration. I mean, those happen in every circumstance where large numbers of people are moving in. It's happening in Metro Atlanta and in Cobb County right now, where I grew up. I mean, those are largely not even immigrants from the rest of the world. They're from the rest of the country, though. And we're having issues with transit, with traffic, with infrastructure, so on and so forth. Those are all fair points to make. But I think when he starts making it a cultural argument, I think in some of his tweets, he talked about how these people are from a very different culture, right? And I think that allays into what he's talking about with the animals and the pets. It's kind of suggesting that these are kind of like an alien group of folks. They're not compatible with us here in the United States, that they somehow have some kind of inferior or backwards attitude. And look, that's JD. That's exactly how people talk about your ancestors, about Scots-Irish, right? Like, where's the term cracker come from in the U.S. context? It was a term used to derogate poor people, Scots-Irish, largely in the South, who were seen as just following alien customs. They were ill-tempered. They were quick to fight with each other. They were very backwards, and they could never make anything of themselves. Of course, that's wrong, JD, because you're a U.S. senator now. You went to Yale Law School, but when you were growing up, I'm sure plenty of people looked down upon you. They said that you're just you're white trash. You're backwards. Your family's all messed up. They could list a million different ways of things that were wrong, but you knew that you were worth more than that, right? And I think that's a lot of what I would say about these people. They're, you can't judge them, I think, in this way that kind of makes them in this category where they're never going to make anything of themselves, because the reality is, look, Haitians have been in the U.S. in large numbers since probably the 1960s. There's like 500,000 Haitian Americans in Florida, right? And I don't think Florida Republicans are going to be quick to demonize those people because it would be politically toxic for them to do so. And I don't think it's going to be any different from these people moving into Springfield, right? Springfield was losing population for a number of years, right? I went to grad school up in Syracuse. I was there for 12 months to do my master's. Syracuse and a lot of those upstate New York towns, all those Rust Belt towns, deindustrialized towns, were in a death spiral because people moving out meant that you had not only fewer jobs, but you also had you had less tax revenue, right? Meaning they couldn't fund services, meaning that they couldn't keep a lot of the city going as people continued to move out. So they were constantly trying to get people to move in. And that's what Springfield did around 2014. They started a campaign and said, hey, people need to move here, along with a bunch of other towns in Ohio, by the way. And they found some success by having people from the rest of the country, people from other countries start moving into Springfield, start taking jobs, start working, providing, revenue, economic growth. I mean, look, it's true that a lot of big employers and big business want immigrants to come to the country to loosen the labor market, sometimes to lower wages, to give them more of an affordable deal. But that doesn't really mean that in every circumstance possible, immigrants are bad for your community or bad for your country, right? And a place that's dying, that needs people to come back, it needs people to come from anywhere to come there and develop and start actually, not only bring new jobs, but also tax revenue, new construction, housing, so on and so forth. It's not really a bad thing to have people moving there and actually rejuvenate the place. And of course, there'll be growing pains in doing that, but a mature way to respond to that would be to go to that community, understand their needs, and talk it out rationally, right? Rather than turning it into a giant political circus that has, unfortunately, now these racial overtones.
Yeah. Zaid, your response was very compelling and also very diplomatic. Mine was a little less so. I can put it up on the screen. What JD said to you kind of irritated me because now that he's provoked this whole, outrageous racial panic, he wants to say, oh, let's have a nuanced conversation about housing, which is my point here. I said, when you insist on spreading neo-Nazi-fueled smears about immigrants, which these pet cat dog lies were fueled by literal neo-Nazis, leading to bomb threats kind of closes the space for this intellectual discussion about pluses and minuses of immigration that you're now retreating to. Dude, he didn't like that very much. He says, Krystal Ball, I really hate neoliberalism. I'm a populist. Also, Krystal Ball, anyone who doesn't think 20,000 cheap laborers should be dropped on a small Ohio town is a neo-Nazi, which is not what I said. But in any case, I would also say someone who has a 0% voting record with the AFL-CIO and who owes his position in significant part to a billionaire backer maybe doesn't really have a lot of leg to stand on with regard to populism. But putting that aside, Zaid, I'll bring you in for the diplomatic response here. When you lead with the very racial angle that's just about culture and is also just a total lie, and not about any of these more legitimate topics of conversation, I don't think that helps enable that broader, more nuanced, potential theoretical conversation that he now wants to have after initially starting this panic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Like, look, if someone was trying to talk about, Israel, this is a topic that's been all over the news in the past almost a year now, and they started with an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, right? They can't really fall back and say, well, look, I just want to have a conversation about foreign policy.
Yeah, that's a great point.
You need to be careful about how you engage in these things. And I think this is something the Republicans are learning because, like I said, this is probably the first time during the Biden administration where they're really losing an immigration debate, where they said something that people just don't believe, that make them look, like they're trying to start some kind of racial or cultural conflict rather than deal with the very real challenges of, I think, increasing levels of immigration. And at the same time, I want to say something about, he questioned your posture as a populist. I mean, the reality is that the history of populism in the United States and to some extent elsewhere, but I know more about the United States, is that when we develop these kind of us versus them frames, immigration and race and culture does get drawn into that at times, right? So like I'm reading this book about Tom Watson. Mm-hmm. Tom Watson was this great, Georgia populist, right? And the first half of his life, he was fighting against convict leasing, which was like 90% black in Georgia, which is like slavery by another name, used by many of the richest and wealthiest politicians in Georgia to undercut wages and also just to expose prisoners to brutal conditions. I mean, far worse than prison labor today. I mean, it basically was slavery. But in the second half of his life, he became basically an outright white nationalist, right? And he was against African Americans and so on and so forth. I mean, this is a guy who went from organizing bands of men to protect blacks from lynching to advocating for those very same things in the second half of his life. And like that was all part of the populist tradition in Georgia, right? You could mobilize people against the landed gentry and like the big farms and being agrarian populist, but also you could say, hey, we have a white interest against Black folks, against Jews, Catholics, so on and so forth. And I think, Vance needs to consider that trajectory for his own life, right? Does he want to fall into that kind of dark side of populism? Does he want to be someone, questioning illegal immigration, talking about border security, all those things are valid. And that's always going to be a case. It's always been the case in American politics that those things are hot button topics. Republican Party in particular has always been very active in talking about them. But when it comes to actually suggesting that, this latest wave of immigrants, whoever coming to the United States, in the case of the Haitians, they are legal. They have legal status under TPS, that they're somehow incompatible with our values, with our culture. At that point, you're kind of chopping up people who are just trying to work and get by and pitting them against each other, right? And, you want to talk about big employers and what they do to undercut wages and why they advocate for looser immigration. That's all fair and good. But once we start, having a conflict between people from varying ethnicities and ancestries and cultures, look, one of Donald Trump's worst moments on the debate stage is when he stood up there and said he didn't have a healthcare plan. He had a concept of a healthcare plan. Yeah. Somewhere in this country right now, a husband and wife are talking about how they can't afford, a life-saving procedure, or how they're facing bankruptcy and tears are streaming down their face. JD, spend a little bit of time talking to your boss about how he's going to address that problem. There's so many problems you can address in this country without pitting, the latest poor guy who arrived on our shores is just trying to make a business for himself and a life for himself and a family in Ohio, right, against another person who's also trying to do that, right? And that happens to be the case in Springfield.
So, Zaid, let me push you a little bit, and let's think about this. Donald Trump passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. He abandoned a lot of the so-called, economic policy that he ran on, if he ever believed it in the first place, and he got 10 million more votes. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the political science research on immigration and others, some of the people who vote for him on immigration don't care about the economic concern. So maybe in an era, Krystal and I just had a massive debate on this, maybe in an era of rapid demographic change, the cultural argument is actually the one that resonates the most with people. So, you may think it's immoral or you may think it's wrong, but what is your confidence that it is the political loser that you believe it to be?
Look, I think it probably depends on where and when you're talking about, particularly in Europe. I think that there is and actually I'm going to write a story about this because there was a good paper on it. There is a representation gap between public officials and the general public. The general public does think immigration is happening too quickly. The pace of change is too rapid, and they tend to, I think most of their backlash is about culture. Eric Kaufman, who's a kind of a political scientist, a little bit conservative leaning, but very fair and honest, has said that in the survey work, that's what they find. It's not really about economics, not about logistics. It's about culture. People think their culture is being replaced or under attack and that it's dwindling compared to some kind of foreign culture, which they don't really like or understand. That's particularly the case in Europe. In the United States, some of the immigration backlash, probably most of the immigration backlash, honestly, is dealing with those factors. But I don't think it really shows up as a political winner overall. I don't think there's a ton of evidence that Americans believe that their culture overall is being overwhelmed or somehow subsumed or replaced by foreign cultures. Not just because there's a differing nature in the nature of the countries, right? The United States is not founded on ethnicity. It's not founded on one religion or creed, really. It's founded more based on, there was a set of Northern Europeans or WASPs who founded the U.S., but each wave of immigrants who came in, successfully assimilated, and while at the same time somewhat changing the culture at a pace and rate that I think has generally been accepted by Americans. You mentioned, for instance, that Trump increased his minority votes, but I think part of that also is in 2020, he barely talked about immigration relative to 2016. I think he had shifted to other issues. I think things like him railing against COVID lockdowns probably appealed to a lot of people who maybe don't really particularly mind immigration, don't particularly mind, a more diverse culture in some ways, but maybe were aggravated by democratic, bureaucratic demands in one way, shape, or form. I do think, Saagar, what you're describing probably is very powerful in the Republican Party at this moment. I think a lot of them probably would crack down even on legal migration, which I think is part of their complaint about the Haitians and about TPS. But I'm not so sure it's such a winner overall. I'll give you an example. My governor here in Georgia, Brian Kemp, he made a point to go and campaign before first and second generation immigrant communities. So he went to a Diwali event outside Global Mall, which is this big, South Asian, Indian, and Pakistani shopping center in Georgia. And I don't think he said anything beyond, condemning illegal immigration, the same rote things as everyone else. And the guy's sitting on a 61 or 63% approval rating. And I think John Ossoff probably lays awake at night hoping the NRSC does not recruit him for Senate because, a state like Georgia, Old South, used to be a cradle of the Confederacy, is also a state that's rapidly changing. And yet, you go to a small town. I do improv comedy in a small town that voted 75% for Trump. And yet, every street corner is an immigrant. There's a Hispanic festival happening. Half my team is Asian or Black, right? Like, that's a Republican county that I'm in, right? Like, I think for the most part, people in this country are accepting of those things. And the people in the middle, what they don't like is lawlessness. They don't like chaos. They don't like border towns being overwhelmed and then people being shipped this way or that way and it feeling disorderly, right? Like people are being put upon. I think that's what they dislike. But America is one of the last countries on earth. I think we're going to get away with this argument that, like, you can't have anybody but WASPs in the country. We're not that kind of people. I don't think that really gets to who we are as Americans. And that's where JD, I think, is making a political misstep here. And even if he feels that way, look, dude, like, this country is going to be like 60 to 70% white for your entire lifetime, dude. You got to get people to have more babies. White folks got to have more babies. That's not my fault. They're not having more babies. I think even JD has said this at one point, that they need to have more kids. So like, work on family policy to get that achieved. But you don't have to worry about being, your culture being wiped out. I'm less than 1% of the country. My culture is very strong. Our families are very strong. I feel very secure in it. But that's partly on me, right? It's partly about how I engage to preserve my traditions and my culture. And I think JD has every right to do that with his family lineage going back to Eastern Kentucky.
Zed, to bolster your point, you made the point about the Republican governor of Georgia, the Republican governor of Ohio also came out and said basically, like, stop doing this, stop doing what you're doing. And he also is, quite popular in the state of Ohio, won election handily last time, actually outperformed JD Vance by quite a significant margin. I think he also didn't have as strong as an opponent as JD Vance. But to bolster your point about the politics of this, put B3 up on the screen. It's not just some of the aspects that you point to that I think Americans don't like. I think they also don't like being lied to. And an overwhelming majority of Americans, huge gap between those who think that this is true and those who think that it is false. So majority, 54% say this is false, 26% say that it is true. A majority of Trump voters do buy the Haitian pet lie. Effectively, no Harris voters buy it. And then the independents, it was, quite lopsided in favor of, no, this is a lie. If you look at men, 54% say it's a lie. If you look at women, 55% say it's a lie. So yes, within the Republican base, they buy whatever it is that Trump wants to sell them, but they're already voting for Donald Trump. And more of those, swing voters, independents, et cetera, they see pretty clearly through the game that they're playing here.
Yeah, and look, I think that I'm not someone who's saying that, like, any skepticism towards immigration, particularly when we're talking about the lawlessness that happens, at the border with drugs and crime and guns and gangs and so on and so forth, it should be taboo. Obviously, it should not be taboo. And I think when you do the same polls of Americans about those issues, they're very concerned about it. And it's a perfectly legitimate thing for the Republicans to address and bring up that Biden has failed to handle a lot of that properly and create a more orderly immigration system. I think where they're, like you said, I think where they're really kind of falling off is by creating this kind of cultural conflict between saying, okay, I'll give you guys an example, like Douglas Murray, right? He's like this kind of posh right-wing British commentator. After there were some riots in the UK,
supporter, but
right, very much so. After there were some riots in the UK, there was a stabbing. Actually, I think it was by an African migrant who was of Christian background. For some reason, someone spread a rumor it was Muslims. So there were all these riots aimed at mosques and the Muslim communities. And then Murray comes up and says, "Look, this is the result of you don't let us talk about immigration. And what do you expect? Blah blah blah." And it's like, dude, every election in the West, just particularly in Europe, for the past 10 years has been about immigration. It's constantly all over the news, Daily Mail, so on and so forth. But I think really what he means, the frustration he's feeling, is you can't just say that, why don't we just keep our countries white, right? Like, that's probably what he feels. And I think that there is a faction in the Republican Party who feels that way. But my counter to that is that faction, I think, is very online. Like, they tend to be people who have prestigious positions at think tanks who tweet a lot and put out white papers. But in the actual world of Republicans, you go to Florida, Texas, Georgia, you see diverse communities, voting Republican. You see people in very small towns in rural parts of the country welcoming, Tejanos and people who have roots who are 1 or 2 generations removed from the United States and from European American culture, right? I think in the actual world, there isn't quite nearly as much hostility towards these things as you might see among, certain right-wing influencers, among the Charlie Kirks of the world, among some of the people maybe JD follows on Twitter or on social media. And I think the Republican Party needs to calibrate for that if it wants to survive. And I'm not doing the 2012, autopsy saying they have to be 100% pro, legalize everybody, loose immigration policies, so on and so forth. But they do have to avoid being racist, right? They have to avoid being racist, and they have to avoid looking like they just want the country to be full of white folks, because that's not the country anymore. And a lot of people who are curious about voting Republican, who agree with Republicans on taxes, who agree with Republicans on social policy, they want, strong police. They're kind of skeptical about abortion, the morality of abortion, particularly a lot of these Latin American immigrants are. A lot of those people want to vote Republican, but they're not going to vote Republican if they feel like they're being insulted every day, right? Or someone's going to spread some racist theory about their group every day. If they're putting those kind of people into power, right? And that, I think, is the line they need to kind of straddle. And I think Vance needs to understand this, that a lot of what he's saying about global capital, a lot of what he's saying about families and how hard it is to raise a family are true. And they resonate very well with people for good reason. But man, you gotta take race and culture out of it, right? You gotta understand that a lot of the conservative cultural values you value are the same ones probably a lot of those folks coming into Springfield from Haiti value, right? They probably value strong families. They're probably kind of skeptical about abortion. They probably want good policing. I mean, I haven't heard about any big crime wave as a result of these people, probably because they're sick of that from where they came from. They're happy to be in a country with a rule of law, with police, where criminals do get punished, where if somebody ate a cat, they would be punished for it, right? We'd all hear about it. We'd all know about it. Wouldn't have to rely on this blurry video that Chris Rufo's sending around, like UFO, Bigfoot style, right? So...
Well, we're going to find out if you're right or not, Zaid. I'm very curious. I'm of several minds about it, as we've talked about for ad nauseum now at this show. Really appreciate you, as always. Thank you for coming on, and we hope to see you again soon.
Great to see you, Zaid. Thank you.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.